Dr. Davis is the founder and president of Environmental Health Trust. She was founding director of the Center for Environmental Oncology and the University of Pittsburgh Cancer Institute, and founding director of the Board on Environmental Studies and Toxicology for the U.S. National Research Council, National Academy of Sciences. She has authored more than 200 peer-reviewed publications, as well as several books, including Disconnect, The Truth About Cell Phone Radiation, What the Industry is Doing to Hide It, and How to Protect Your Family. Dr. Davis, in her talk, Update on the Science on Wireless Radiation and Health, will provide us with the latest scientific research on wireless radiation and our health. Welcome, Dr. Davis.
Thank you so much, and I want to thank Camilla Reese and the other organizers of this meeting. It's a pleasure to speak after Cece just said. Some of those things she was talking about are projects that the Environmental Health Trust has worked on for several years, and we're happy to work with her and many others to see these things advance. In particular, I want to give a shout out to Theodora Scarata, our executive director, who worked for more than 4 years with the Maryland Governor's Council to see that those guidelines about wireless connections in schools were issued. Unfortunately, as Cece knows, it's one thing to issue guidelines, it's another to actually see them implemented. And that's where forums like the one you're holding today are so important. Because what you can do today is go talk to 10 more people and tell them, this is for real, this is important. And what I'm going to do today is briefly sketch with you why you know that effects of wireless radiation can influence the brain as well as sperm and have a broad range of effects. You've heard about my credentials, so I'll skip that and just share with you the cover of the book, which you can order from Amazon, from our website of ehtrust.org, which unfortunately the book is almost 10 years old. And there's not one word of it that I would change right now. The truth about cell phone radiation is that it does have biological effects. Phones are two-way microwave radios, that they've never been tested for safety in children or smaller people, and as a consequence, we are lying blind, as Senator Richard Blumenthal recently said in a congressional hearing on the FCC. The next slide will show you what the French have done. They have taken over 400 phones off the shelf, and they have tested them in the way that they are used, which is to stay in the pocket next to the skin. Now, why is that important? Because the manufacturers are allowed to test phones up to an inch off the body. And if you do that, you'll see here that they comply with the current test requirements. The French agency tested phones 5 millimeters away and at body contact. And at body contact, just for the iPhone 5 seen here, the radiation from the phone, the microwave radiation from the phone, exceeded the standard by about 3-fold. And they tested, 9 out of 10 phones that they tested exceeded the standards. And when you apply that to the United States, the levels of exceedance are even greater. This is the French government's national agency, which is devoted to testing and monitoring microwave radiation. Now, the French have issued guidance for this year, which, among other things, says that the abdomen of teenagers and pregnant women should be protected from cell phone radiation. I want you to think about that when you see all of these teens in their tight clothing with the phone stuffed into the pockets, some of which have been conveniently provided for them by the clothing manufacturers. People are not aware, again, that phones are two-way microwave radios, and the closer to a body a phone is, the greater that radiation absorption will be. So this briefly will show you what the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation did. Please listen.
Most of us carry our phones next to our bodies. And what do we do with it? Science, tests, and the hidden message in your cell phone. So the tests are all done.
Tests are all finished.
And?
The number exceeded the limit. It went up significantly with each one of the phones.
That's right. The phones exceeded the safety limit when they were moved right against the body. The radiation absorbed increased 3 to 4 times.
Okay, that's right. The radiation from the phones, when tested by an FCC-certified lab, exceeded the current test limits 3 to 4-fold. Now, why is that important? Well, for one thing, it says that the current standards are inadequate. But the other thing is that those levels that were tested have been shown by the National Toxicology Program, which I'm sure you've heard about from many other speakers. Those levels have been shown to increase the risk of rare cancers of the tumor of the heart and of the brain. So we'd be foolish to ignore those results. And what we know is the faster cells grow, the more vulnerable they are. And among the fastest growing cells in the human body is the sperm. We produce, in a human male, they are produced at 90,000 times a minute. It's hard to believe. And think about this. The faster something grows, the faster you can say something, the greater the chance you'll make a mistake. Try saying, Peter Piper picked peppers. Peter Piper picked peppers. Peter Piper, the faster you say it, the greater the chance of making a mistake. So with sperm, they are produced very fast. They have to move quickly, and they have to be able to be strong enough to swim the equivalent from Los Angeles to Hawaii. Now, how many of you know that many men are having serious fertility problems around the world today in industrial countries particularly? That 1 out of every 5 couples that tries to conceive is not able to do so. There are many factors contributing to the infertility problems that we're experiencing around the world, but one of them is certainly cell phone radiation. One of the questions is that we need the sperm to be the strongest one to fertilize an egg. Why do you think it takes so many sperm to make one healthy baby? At least 250 million. Well, some people have suggested it's because sperm don't know how to ask for directions. But the reality is, you want the fastest, healthiest, strongest sperm to survive. And studies have shown that cell phone radiation interferes with that development. The same for our brain. It grows before birth, it's growing at the rate of 250 million a minute. That's 250 million a minute. And by birth, the brain of a baby contains 100 billion neurons. It's about 1/3 the size of the adult. So think about how much the brain grows in the first 2 years of life. It's quite dramatic. And again, the faster something is growing, the greater the possibility of error. And the brain in particular is not fully myelinated. Myelin is a thick protective sheath of fat that grows around neurons. And when it is exposed to cell phone radiation, myelination itself is interfered with. Now, if we look at all the toxic agents that we know that affect the body, and this schematic is just to symbolize them, everything from paints and solvents to x-rays, and wireless radiation there at the top, all of them have the property of being able to pass through membranes, through barriers. And that is exactly what cell phone radiation does. It disrupts the communication around the cell membrane. And we have many studies that have shown this, which you can find on our website at ehtrust.org. I'm having trouble advancing the slides on my end. I'm not sure why. There we go. This next imaging shows you the amount of absorption that takes place in the brain of a 6-year-old. And if you watch carefully as it rotates, you will see that the absorption really goes almost entirely through the head of this young child, and is highest right at the ear, then going into the temporal and frontal lobes. And this is important because phones themselves have changed, and the nature of radiation has changed. Old phones had the antenna over at the top of the phone, right here. Newer phones have antennas all the way around here. A paper was just published last week indicating that there is clearly an increased risk of thyroid cancer in those who've used phones the most, and their risk is appearing in younger people. So we have to pay attention to what we're seeing about the exposures that we know about here, and not presume that children are just little adults, and recognize that their skulls are thinner, that they absorb more because they have more fluid inside their brain, and their vulnerability is, of course, greater because they are young and they are learning. And as I'm sure you've heard, screens themselves can be very addictive for this age group. And the earlier in life you start that process, the harder it is to interfere with it. Now, one example of the negative effects on children has been replicated in studies of teenagers carried out by the Swiss Tropical and Public Health Institute. And they followed up kids 7th through 9th grade and had information from phone records about how often they used a phone for how long. And what they were able to show is significant damage to their memory with the greater use of phones. And references to this and many other things can be found on our website and in these slides. Just 50 minutes of having a phone next to the head, double-blinded, where the person did not know whether the phones were turned on or off, showed a significant uptake right here in the red spot of glucose in the part of the brain with the greatest exposure. Now, why is that of a concern? Because Alzheimer's has been called diabetes of the brain. And when we have agents that are increasing the amount of glucose in the brain, that is, in fact, grounds for concern, as the author of this paper pointed out several years ago. Now, with respect to the testis, as you can see here in this simulation that is produced by my colleague Claudio Fernandez at the University of Rio del Sul in Brazil, this study shows that you get greater absorption here into the penis and the testis with a phone in the pocket. The greatest absorption is into the areas that do not have any protection of bone. And long-term effects on the testis have been demonstrated by studies carried out at the Cleveland Clinic and its counterpart in Australia and India, where they show that men who have used phones the most have the lowest sperm counts. And experimental studies, seen here on the right, that I carried out with colleagues in Iran, we were able to show that control cells, seen here, have nice white borders and boundaries, but the exposed cells, you can see, are compressed and obviously damaged just by the cell phone radiation that interferes with the barriers. That is why the Cleveland Clinic has advised it's best to keep your cell phone as far from the testis as you can. They believe it's implicated not only in reduced sperm count, but in other damage to male reproductive health, including impotence. That is why at Environmental Health Trust you can find our safety cards on our website that you can download. This is one side, and the other side gives you scientific information about studies that have been done showing damage. We also have cards available for downloading on how to protect and why to protect the young breast so that phones are not stored directly on the body. What we can tell you, though, is that sleeping in the dark is extremely important to protect against damage from EMF. Because when we sleep in the dark, we naturally produce a hormone called melatonin, which has the function in the body of repairing damage. Now, just being alive, breathing, being exposed to oxygen and sunlight, we will get some damage to our DNA. But melatonin and fat, seen here as, this was omega-3 fatty acids, produce less damage. These are control brain cells that were not exposed to anything. And you see there's a number of them and they have boundaries themselves. These are EMF exposed, and you see here more openness, more damage. And then when you add the melatonin, or when you add the omega-3 fatty acid, you do not have these large white channels opening, indicating breaking of the barriers in the membranes. So there is evidence of protective effects from melatonin, sleeping in the dark, and unplugging at night, and from a diet that includes omega-3 fatty acids. The American Academy of Pediatrics has been a leader in recommending that children under 2 not have any screen time. And they have recently reaffirmed those recommendations as have other groups, recognizing the damaging effect both socially, psychologically, and of course, in terms of the capacity of the agents of wireless radiation to stimulate dopamine, which is what we get for the pleasure center. So this list here tells you some of the things you can do that have been recommended by these organizations and others. And they include, sorry, this slide is not performing the way it's supposed to. They include very specific recommendations about keeping the phone off the body, not allowing children to use it as a toy, preferring texting instead of calling, using a speakerphone or an air tube headset, and not carrying the phone directly in the body, keeping it on airplane mode when you have to carry it for any length of time. And of course, if you must give a wireless device to a child, please download whatever you want to it first, put it on airplane mode, and then hand it to the child. Of course, we all know the importance of using wired connections whenever possible, and as Cece and others are doing, educate your elected officials and your community. That's why the work of Camilla Reese and others are so important, because they've been in the forefront of educating the public on this issue for years. Now, I want to briefly share with you some new work on DNA damage by telling you about some old work. In 1994, Henry Lai and Vijay Singh produced studies showing that cell phone radiation could damage the DNA in the brain. As I talk about in my book, Disconnect, their work was subject to war games. So almost 10 years later, a multi-million-dollar study was funded for 12 research groups that took 4 years. And that study asked the same question: could cell phone radiation damage the DNA within the brain or other DNA within fibroblasts, within other human cells? And they found, much to the surprise of the leaders of that study, they found clear evidence of DNA damage. That's the point to hold on to. That was published in 2006. It was done, the work was done in 2004. And that work was subject to war games as well. Now, they looked at something called the Comet assay, seen on the screen here. And basically, you see this is a nice intact cell. And this is called the comet, or the tail of the cell. This shows you a measure of degradation of DNA. It should not have any tail at all, as it does here. This is the equivalent of 1,600 chest x-rays, which a baby can get in a CAT scan if the machine is not adjusted properly for the small size of the child. And here you have exposure from 24 hours of exposure to a mobile phone, again, looking at brain cells. And clearly you see, while the tail is a little longer for the chest x-rays, the tail here is also quite long. Now, this was a troubling finding, produced first in 1994, replicated in 2004, published in 2006, and now we have, I'm going to skip this one, toxicology program. The National Toxicology Program has finally been able to publish their own results on exposure of cell phone radiation to DNA in mice and rats through a whole body study over a period of 2 years. And they showed significant increases in DNA damage in both male and female mice and rats. So it's important to understand that although the cancerous results in the NTP showed up significantly only in the male rat, other results from the NTP for DNA damage showed up in both mice and rats, males and females. And so the conclusion that finally got published in the NTP is that cell phone radiation could damage DNA. And remember something, the levels of radiation in the NTP study were lower than you could get from cell phones in your pocket today, because they assumed that the levels were those of phones permitted to emit, and not the actual levels that phones do emit when they're tested next to the body. So we have clear evidence of DNA damage from cell phone radiation at levels lower than what people can be exposed to when phones are in their pockets. And these are the data from the NTP, just published. And if you look here, this is a control, and there's a little bit of DNA damage because that's life. This is the increased exposures, and these are statistically significant results. Both for, this is the male rat hippocampus exposed to one form of cell phone radiation. And this is for the mouse, male and female, the frontal cortex. Here you see the control, a little exposure more, and you see these were non-thermal levels of exposure. Although they are higher than what we are allowed for humans, they did not create any measurable increase in temperature in these animals. And yet, it clearly showed damage to the DNA of the frontal cortex, and the blood was not affected, but the frontal cortex was. And this is published again from the NTP. The implications of these results, which I'm sure you have already discussed, are very, very important. The study was set up to test the assumption that the only effect that made any difference was heat. The NTP findings showed that's not true, because they got no heat was measured, no increase in temperature in these animals, and without any increase in temperature, you got a significant increase in brain tumors and schwannomas. But in addition, I want to remind you, there were cancers in multiple organs in these animals that did not quite reach statistical significance, but were elevated in the exposed animals compared to controls. And there was DNA damage in both rats and mice. So we finally turned to what we know about 5G now in insects. And this was a brilliant paper that was done by the Swiss researchers who are supported by industry and their government to investigate the effect of exposures to RF radiation on, in this case, a honeybee. They took Apis mellifera and they made a model of it, and they measured the exposures to different levels of proposed radiation, 2 gig, 24 gig, and 120 gigahertz. This level here is the level that 5G is allowed to reach. And their simulations showed that just a shift of 10% in the power could triple the amount of radiation absorbed directly into the body of the honeybee. Now, why is that important? Because, again, as you may have heard, because there are experimental studies that show if you put a phone in a hive and turn it on, the bees will stop doing their job of making honey. Now, lastly, I was asked to address the question of climate change in 5G. And as you can imagine, this is a huge topic. I was honored to be a member of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in 2004 that received the Nobel with Al Gore in 2007. And in that capacity, I was able to learn a lot about climate policy and all the things that contribute to it. But for our purposes, the most important thing to understand is this. Smart may not be so smart, because we are increasing efficiency by allowing these devices to have voice and data and photographs and a GPS and all working at the same time. But we're not really increasing the overall efficiency of the network. And what basically, no matter how efficient you may make any smart device, if the demand is growing, which it is, then you're really behind. And that's what seems to be the case for 5G. We are pushing 5G. There will be so many more millions of small cells around the world to be built. And as a consequence, the increase in demand for mobile traffic is going to go up 7-fold just in a few years. Just in a few years. And as a consequence, Camilla Reese's group put out a very important report on the future of landlines and networks that said that wireless devices, antenna networks, and data centers will be consuming an increasing proportion of global energy supply. And more recently, international groups with the Lean Project have also looked at current trends for digital overconsumption and have concluded that they are not sustainable. If something is growing at 9% a year, then it's almost doubled within 10 years. And it cannot be sustained. The worst case scenario is seen here on the top right of the slides. I can move myself over. The scenario right here shows you what will happen if you have a worst case in terms of demand. And the world cannot meet this demand. We cannot meet this projection right now. And so that is why this whole project is called LEAN, in order to try to promote rethinking of the Internet of Things and how much of it really is needed, and how we can make the digital transition more energy efficient by limiting growth to 1.5% a year instead of pushing it to 9% a year. Because, as I wrote recently in an op-ed that you can find on our website and Facebook page, 5G looks to be an energy vampire. It looks like it will suck as much energy as it can possibly take, and as a consequence, it's really going to be very difficult for the world to see a reduction in some of the dreadful things that are already happening. The fires in Australia are a warning sign to all of us. Yes, some of them were started by arsonists in July who were arrested and prosecuted. But the current burden of these fires now, a half a year later, is clearly a reflection of the drought and the severity of the lack of water and the increase of fuels that is driving these bushfires in southeast Australia, which has rendered thousands without their homes right now and led to the deaths so far of a few dozen people. So this is, I think, a warning sign to all of us of what we have to pay attention to. So please look at our website at Environmental Health Trust, where you'll be able to get access to these reports and to all of our work, where we have sheets and pages with information on damage to the tree canopy, effects on honeybees, and our energy calculations, which show that the carbon footprint that will go up from 5G is not sustainable. It's not sustainable. And this is a message that a number of groups have been issuing for some time. I hope that with the work that you will be doing after this meeting, there'll be more and more attention paid to this very important issue. Thank you so much.